So, welcome everybody. And today we'll be speaking to another author from the forthcoming book, Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission. And today we'll be hearing from Ruth Harley, who's the co-author of Holding Space with Al Barrett. So, hello, Ruth. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, of course. Hi, Carol, and hello, everyone. So, my name is Ruth Harley. I'm a priest in the Church of England, and at the moment, I'm a curate in Milton Keynes, which is in the Diocese of Oxford, and I'm working in a local ecumenical partnership here. And in my academic life, which gets squeezed in around the edges of all that, I'm an ecclesiologist. So I'm particularly interested in questions of how power functions within the church and how the church functions in relation to power.
Okay, thank you. Um, so could you briefly talk about what your chapter's about?
Sure. So we took as our starting point for this chapter Willie James Jennings' phrase, the facilitating obsession of whiteness. And we wanted to really interrogate how whiteness functions in the context of facilitation. So both Al, my co-author, and I are influenced by kind of social justice focused models of mission. And in those contexts, you often get quite an emphasis on facilitation as a collaborative practice. And we really wanted to kind of problematize the idea of facilitation as something neutral, and in particular, the figure of the kind of what we've named the good white facilitator. So the phrase we're using to help us think about that is that phrase that's in the title of the chapter, holding the space. So we've spent a bit of time around the word hold and around the word space, and also facilitation and speaking, and considering some of the resonances that those words have in conversation with Black theologians and Black theorists outside the field of theology as well. And really, what we haven't done is come up with a model of good white facilitation, because we don't think that's
Mm,
possible.
mm,
But what we have come up with, we hope, is some prompts, some questions, some unsettlings to kind of move us beyond that idea that facilitation necessarily is or even can be a neutral thing, particularly
mm.
when it's happening in that context of whiteness.
Okay, thank you. Um, what made you take this particular approach to your chapter?
Yeah, so we were building in some sense on some of our previous work around um, how we understand mission and how we understand agency within mission and who has agency and where that's located. And we've critiqued in the past models that are very kind of, the doer and the done unto. But what we really wanted to do here is examine our own entanglements in systems of whiteness. And to do that, we wanted to look at a model of mission that is much closer to something that we might be involved in, which is how we came to facilitation as being the thing that we wanted to examine and critique.
Mm,
And then, in terms of the kind of approach we've taken to that, as I say, we've taken quite a sort of fragmentary approach to it. It's not a systematic from a problem to a solution kind of a thing. What we're offering are kind of fragments of thought and of question and of unsettling. And I think that kind of that fragmentary approach reflects our commitment to moving away from that more sort of linear pattern, which often ends up reinforcing the status quo, even if what you think you're doing is trying to examine it,
mm,
if that makes sense.
yeah.
And we were very keen to move away from any kind of model that is about fixing a problem,
Mm,
because the power dynamics inherent in that, however you approach it, are really quite troubling. So we're wanting to move into more of a model of, we've been very influenced by the work of Donna Haraway and her phrase, staying with the trouble. So that's kind of what we're aiming to do here, is to stay with the trouble of some of those assumptions of neutrality that you find about facilitation.
Okay, thank you. So moving more specifically to talking about you, what has shaped your social conscience, especially concerning issues of race and inclusivity, etc.?
Sure, this is such a great question. I was jotting down a few notes before we started talking. And for me, I think partly it goes back right to really early childhood. So I was taken on anti-apartheid marches in my pram, which I don't remember. Obviously, I was too little. But I do remember in the early 90s doing all my colouring and drawing at home on the back of old anti-apartheid leaflets and posters that weren't needed anymore. That was our kind of scrap paper. I also grew up in a context where there was quite a lot of asylum seekers arriving and significant tensions in our community and sometimes violence around that. So that shaped my consciousness quite early on. And then in terms of thinking more systematically about it, that probably started for me towards the end of my time at university, when I discovered the work of Sarah Ahmed and started reading her stuff. I started reading it because I wanted to read her feminist writing, and then of course became drawn into her anti-racist writing, because for her it's completely inextricable, which of course it is.
Yeah.
And then I went to work in a very racially diverse context. I was working in the church, but also in local schools. Most of the schools there, quite a small proportion of the children were white British. And that really opened my eyes to the reality of people's lives a bit more. And also, I was very lucky in that context that I had some really good Black colleagues who were very patient with me and very willing to share their perspective with me. I have such a strong memory, if I can just share a little story for a moment, of I was working as a youth worker, and it's a bit of a stereotype that youth workers all wear hoodies. We don't, but I was at the time. And I remember I made some sort of joke about it, or somebody said something. I can't remember what set it off, but what I remember is my colleague, who is a Black man, saying to me, well, you'll have noticed I don't wear a hoodie to do youth work, because you wearing a hoodie in a park late at night is read very differently from me wearing a hoodie in a park late at night as a young Black man. And I just never thought about it. That was one of those moments of realizing my own obliviousness, and that kind of obliviousness that I am allowed to have as a white person. And then over the years, my thinking has been influenced by lots of Black theologians, as you would expect. So Anthony Reddie, Willie James Jennings, Dolores Williams, Kelly Brown Douglas has been a really big influence on my thinking. Also critical white theologians, in particular Jennifer Harvey and her work around disidentifying with the figure of Jesus, as being something that is a really helpful practice for white people to adopt. And then I trained for ordination at the Queen's Foundation in Birmingham, which is the home of the Centre for Black Theology. And Black Theology is a compulsory module for all students at Queen's, which is fantastic. And we need more of that in more theological colleges in this country. And there I encountered a kind of pedagogy that was really aimed at forming actively anti-racist clergy. And that has been hugely influential on me. And at the same time, I was able to see some of that being put into practice in the parish that I was attached to at that time. And then I think there's an ongoing journey. I'm very fortunate to have Black people who I think of as mentors in my life. I think that's really helpful to me in this kind of work. But also to have one or two, and it is a fairly small circle, of other critical white theologians who are also clergy, who can hold each other to account, and ask each other hard questions about that. And I think that kind of that collective journey is quite an important influence for me.
Thank you for sharing that. What do you think are the biggest challenges that face the church and wider society in terms of uh, issues of social justice?
Gosh, this is a huge question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think for me, I was thinking about this. There's so many factors that we could name, but I think underlying a lot of it for me is a kind of an unwillingness to sit with discomfort and uncertainty and ambiguity. It feels to me that culturally and theologically, actually, there's a real drive for, well, we must be able to solve this, or there must be an answer, or and that prevents us from doing some of the deeper work of disentangling some of the really kind of complex stuff that is underlying the big social injustices that we see around us. And I think as well, an assumption, particularly among those of us who are privileged in any way, whether that's around race or gender or sexuality or ability or class, any of those dynamics, kind of a desire to keep returning to safety, to experience discomfort as something temporary from which we must be able to return or escape or get away, and that kind of return to a comfortable place is what we're aiming for. And that dynamic is really paralyzing because it prevents us from moving into those spaces of discomfort, of being having our kind of norms destabilized in a way that enables us to be really critical and really interrogate some of the underlying structures that lead to injustice. And then we end up doing the sort of sticking plaster things
Mm,
because they're the easy things, because they don't push us into something that makes us feel uncomfortable. So I think that unwillingness to sit with discomfort and ambiguity, I think that is fueled by an anxious church. Certainly, the Church of England is institutionally anxious on a massive scale, which really doesn't help. I think it's also fueled a bit by theologies which are rooted in quite uncritical approaches to power, theologies which maybe don't delve deeply enough into questions about power, that don't delve
mm,
deeply enough into examining just how different things could be and should be if we really mean thy kingdom come
mm,
on earth as in heaven. Um, and fundamentally, for me, that's about having too small an image of God, actually. There's
mm,
something about developing a more expansive and a more generous and a more unbounded image of God that sets us free to be able to live with that greater degree of ambiguity and uncertainty and discomfort as something which can exist within our understanding of who God is and who we are in God. So I think there's some really deep roots, actually, to some of the things that are troubling us in terms of social justice.
mm. Yeah, a very big question, but I think you've given us a few good things to think about. Yeah, definitely. So, coming to a close, what do you hope people will take from your chapter?
So I hope that particularly people who read it from a similar position to myself and Al, so people who are white Christians, clergy, or others in leadership who are committed to a kind of collaborative approach to social justice and who are frequently in a position where we are asked or expected to be in a facilitating role. I
Mm,
hope that people reading from that perspective, what they will come away with is a much more critical awareness of the issues at play in that. Um, and I hope that people coming from that position or positions adjacent to that will be willing to take up the kind of invitation that we offer towards the end of the chapter, which is an invitation to inhabit ambivalence is our first thing, to move into that space of knowing that we don't know. To acknowledge particularity, so to own the fact that we are not neutral, and whiteness is so far from a neutral thing. It's really about as far as you can get from neutral. And to embrace limitedness. So to know that there are limits to what we can know and what we can do and what spaces we can inhabit. And that sometimes that limitedness actually is what enables us to engage with perspectives far broader than our own, but on their own terms and not on terms that we are setting and facilitating. And I hope for anyone reading our chapter that what they will come away with is that sense of moving beyond our own agency and control and into the kind of wildness of liberation and reconciliation that we find in God, who is not constrained by our structures and limitations. It's that expansiveness again. So although we are quite critical in our work, I hope that in the end what people come away with is that expansive sense of how much beyond us God is.
Thank you. Thank you for your contribution today. It's been really good to hear from you, and I'm sure people will look forward to reading your chapter. So thank you, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Carol.